Greetings. Welcome to part 3 of Edward Abbey's master's thesis, a deep dive. If you're just joining us for the first time, we'll do a quick recap on who this guy was. He was an environmental advocate who wrote a lot of great books, one of which on the fiction side was The Monkey Wrench Gang, published in 1975. Today we are looking at part 3 of his master's thesis, which was published in 1959. I'm not going to spend time reviewing in detail what we covered in the last 2 videos, so if you're interested in learning more about that, make sure you watch them in this playlist of Edward Abbey's master's thesis. Today we're starting with the anarchist Pierre-Joesph Proudhon, and let's give a little background onto who this guy was in case you're not familiar with his philosophy and ideas. Pierre-Joesph Proudhon was born in 1809 and died in 1865. He was a French philosopher, economist, political theorist who's best known for his influential ideas on anarchism, mutualism, and socialism. Proudhon is most famous for his assertion that property is theft, which he put forth in his 1840 book, What is Property? In this work, he argued that private property was inherently exploitive and led to inequality, and that a system of mutualism in which people voluntarily exchange goods and services without interference of a ruling class was a fairer and more just alternative. Proudhon also believed in the abolition of the state, advocating for a society in which people would govern themselves through voluntary associations and democratic decision-making processes. His ideas on anarchism and mutualism had a significant impact on later anarchists and social thinkers such as Mikhail Bundik and Peter Kropotkin. In addition to his political philosophy, Proudhon has made important contributions to economic thought, particularly in the areas of banking and credit. He argued that the banking system should be organized and focused on mutual credit associations rather than for-profit banks, and that this would allow for a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources. Overall, Proudhon's ideas continue to influence political and economic thought, and his legacy as a major figure in history of anarchism and socialism is still felt today. Alrighty. Edward Abbey starts by introducing Proudhon by comparing him to Goodwin. He talks about his origin story, being born into lower middle class, why he's famous, we just talked about that, and then he goes into detail on describing what Pierre meant by this concept of property as theft, and he defines this line between owning property so that you can exploit others, such as someone, say they were renting a farm or renting a building where people would live. That landlord could be exploitive, and that's not what Pierre likes. And then there's property as possession, where he uses the term man to control his own home, the tools and the land or the shop he needs to work and live from. Proudhon regarded this as a foundation of freedom. He set himself in a permanent opposition to the Marxist communists, not only because they justified the authoritarian state, but because they wished to abolish private property. So this is a type of property that Proudhon argued for in his book through the eyes of Edward Abbey. Let's check out page 11. Page 11. First paragraph on page 11 we continue learning more about Proudhon's ideas. The sentence is introduced with this idea that he's the self-announced father of anarchism, which Abbey disputes, thinks that's a little too much for someone, I think in Abbey's eyes, who doesn't fall within the framework of Abbey's personal view on anarchism, someone who is a little more open to violence, perhaps. And then we go on to learn more about this idea of advocating for a loosely federated society of small independent producers, farmers, and craftsmen, bound together by a system of free contracts and mutual labor. Paragraph 2 starts with a comparison to Goodwin again, where Proudhon was inclined to distrust the use of violence as an instrument of progress, although his language was anything but pacifist or moderate when, and that's the last word on that. We can see a couple works cited here. Number 12, of European Anarchism by Josiah Warren. United States has proclaimed the sovereignty of the individually as early as 1933. And then citation number 13, George Woodcock, Proudhon's most recent bibliographer, raising questions of Goodwin's possible influence upon Proudhon, points out that the latter of his property is theft classifications. Goodwin and Owen classifies Goodwin with Owen as a communist, making it improbable that Proudhon had read the Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. That's an interesting citation there. A lot to unpack. I'm not going to get too deep into it here, but I will leave by saying I'm curious about the George Woodcock's bibliography being influenced by the Soviet Union and the Cold War. Okay, page 12. Page 12 starts with an introduction to a quote that's purpose is to highlight Proudhon's temperament or temper. So we will read that now. To be governed is to have every deed of ours, every action and movement noted, registered, reviewed, docketed, measured, filed, assessed, guaranteed, licensed, authorized, recommended, prohibited, checked, reformed, redressed, corrected under pretensions of public policies, taxed, and it just goes on and on. I'm going to stop reading it here. This is a powerful sentence, and I think it's a great list. It's very philosophical. It's a creative writing strategy to use lists like this, and it really engages the reader. I can see why Edward Abbey would have liked this, and has actually used this style later on in his writing, like many creative writers do. So that's just really neat. That's a gem from 1851, in my opinion. It's clear that Abbey admired his temperament. And then he goes into the next paragraph to start with a negative viewpoint by saying, nevertheless, despite the intemperament tone, Proudhon opposed the use of force in politics, suggesting instead a program of general anarchist education, which he hoped would lead gradually and peacefully to the suppression one by one of the various functions of the state. The social revolution is seriously compromised. That's a quote, wrote Proudhon in his diary in 1845. If it come through a political revolution, by political revolution he meant violence, the workers, once they are organized and marching through work to the conquest of the world, should in no event make an uprising but become all by invading through force of principle. So he's really focused on the principal ideas here of what it means to be an educated anarchist. To this he adds, and that's the last part of this page in terms of Abbey's writing, we have two citations, number 14 and 15. The first one talks about says, as translated and quoted by Albert Weisbeard in The Conquest of Power, New York, published 1937. And then the next one is George Woodcock's Pierre-Joesph Proudhon bibliography. So page 13 starts mid-sentence, that the social revolution can be accomplished peacefully through the establishment of economic association for exchange of produce and cooperative labor. He places the scene of the approaching struggle, not in the street, but on the land, in the workshops and factories. The economic associations referred to above, which Proudhon saw as the logical resolution of the old social contradiction of liberty and regulation, would achieve ultimate success in his vision through the gradual and peaceful extension of their activities on a wholly voluntary basis throughout European society, each industrial center functioning as an independent but not isolated nexus of an organizational network. Citation number 17. And 16. That was way too long of a sentence. If I was friends with Edward Abbey when he wrote this, I would have said, hey, make that like 10 short declarative sentences. Lots of good ideas there. I'm not going to go too deeply into them beyond just commenting on the writing style. It's in the next paragraph that Edward Abbey starts to talk about Proudhon's opinion of revolutionary violence and this concept of violence that is so central to the questions posed in this thesis. Abbey writes, Proudhon's opinion of revolutionary violence is further elaborated in his letter of 1846 to Karl Marx, replying to Marx's proposal of a sustained correspondence to be carried on among radicals of all nations for the purpose of refining political propaganda and promoting international cooperation among revolutionaries. Proudhon reluctantly agrees to the proposal, skipping some things to get to the heart of this part, avoiding the tendency of revolutionary thought to become dogmatic, intolerant, and fanatic, and the tendency of revolutionary leaders such as Marx to regard themselves as apostles of a new religion. Let us never regard a question as exhausted when we have used our last argument. Let us begin again, if necessary, with eloquence and irony. So we end page 13 with Edward Abbey showing more of who Proudhon was, his communication with Karl Marx, and not a lot of substance on his ideas towards using violence to promote his ideas. Page 14, of course, starts with the completion of the sentence from page 13, which says, on that condition, I will gladly enter your association. Otherwise, no. We have our citations below, all from previously cited works. And then we go on to get a quote from Marx's talk on action. In this discussion from Marx's talk, we learn more about his ideas of what reform could be. So he says no reform is possible without a coup de main. And I let's just call that a coup d'etat, an overthrowing of the government, without what was formerly called a revolution, and is really nothing but a shock. That opinion, which I understand, having myself shared for a long time, my most recent studies have made me completely abandon. I believe we have no need of it in order to succeed, and that consequently we should put forward revolutionary action as a means of social reform, because that pretended means would simply be an appeal to force, to arbitrariness, in brief, a contradiction. I myself put the problem in this way: through political economy, to turn the theory of property against property is such a way as to engineer liberty or equality. I would therefore prefer to burn property by slow fire rather than give it new strength, making it St. Bartholomew's Night of the Proprietors. To this letter, Marx never replied. Doubtless, he found it disappointing. Soon afterwards, he became one of Proudhon's most faithful enemies, and we can see why. Marx thinks Proudhon's ideas are so ridiculous that he just mocks them in this paragraph of back and forth, oppositionally logical ideology. Abbey goes on then to describe how Proudhon's aversion to violence was tested by the French Revolution, particularly the hectic days of 1848, where he knew things were going to get crazy and he would have to choose what he was going to do when that happened. A couple quotes here. In the shuffle, he wrote in his diary, "There is no longer room for any reason. I am more and more convinced that I have no place in this situation." And a little later on, the day the Republic was established, he wrote, "The mess is going to be," on to page 15, "inextricable. I have no place in it. They have made a revolution without ideas." He suffered apparently from a curious mixture of emotions during the time of the actual fighting, notwithstanding his profession of being made out of it. He could not repress his sympathies for the workers nor resist the contagion of revolutionary activity. He remained in Paris throughout the time of the disturbance and took some hand in the erection of street barricades. A familiar Parisian rite, printed one of the first Republican manifestos, and was present, according to Woodcock, at the invasion of Tuileries by the people, an event which Flaubert described in a novel, A Sentimental Education, as being more in the character of a holiday outing than military engagement. And then we have a quote from this book published in 1957. So that's paragraph 1 on page 15, which puts Proudhon in this camp of not being a violent anarchist, but even though he had this powerful idea of property as theft. The second paragraph talks about how Proudhon's ideas about how violence would fail to effectively create this anarchist vision of his view of property failed because of the violence. It didn't work. Abbey writes, "But the passage of time and events of 48 did nothing to lighten Proudhon's disillusion. On the contrary, most of the gloomy premonitions were fulfilled, particularly his central thesis that social reform could not be effected through a merely political reform. The suppression of the June uprising, followed in December by the overwhelming victory of Louis Napoleon in the plebiscite, confirmed his antipathy to political rearrangements sanctioned either by violence or demiological head count. My takeaway from this paragraph is that it explains why Abbey included this philosopher in his thesis. He's unique in the sense that he wrote this famous work called Property of Theft. He was identified as an anarchist who was anti-violent, lived in Paris during the French Revolution, saw that fail to create the types of reforms he was advocating for, and went on to tell the story. For that reason, I think Edward Abbey would be pretty attracted to his ideas, even if they didn't perfectly nest or answer his questions posed in his master's thesis. Let's go to page 16. This page starts by reaffirming Abbey's point that Proudhon was most empathetically rejecting violence. And I paraphrase that a little bit to make the point that Proudhon was an anti-violent anarchist. He lists a work that he calls almost encyclopedic, and I'm going to fast forward through this to hit the major points. Moral equilibrium is based in turn on self-respect of the individual and on the consent condition of mutual respect among individuals. When this state of mutual respect is destroyed by violations on the part of some of the liberty of others, the inevitable result is, skipping some words here, fear, hatred, and violence, a violence which, far from restoring equilibrium, generates further violence. In arguments which recall those of Goodwin's, he concentrates his view in an examination of the moral efficacy of regicide. Not sure what that word means. If you know, put it in the comments below. I'd be curious to learn. And we have a citation number 26, or as he terms it, that's a French word, three French words. I'm not going to try and pronounce them because I'm definitely not a native speaker. So then he goes on to end page 16 by talking about Proudhon referring to his own reputation among the French as an incendiary revolutionary, the secret author of innumerable criminal assaults upon public order, decency, and authority. So Proudhon wants people to be morally better without being violent. That's what Abbey's saying on page 16. Page 17 talks about the moral complicity in an assassination or an attempted assassination as a tool or mechanism for overthrowing a leader. And he once again says that this is senseless and useless, and it will not help create this idea of a society that Proudhon wants. So we end the first long paragraph with the following: the only way to eliminate this schism and restore the social peace is by reuniting the material interest equality with the spiritual liberty under the regime of justice. In fact, for Proudhon, the union of the two interests, neither of which can exist without the other, is equivalent to justice. Page 17 ends by sharing the idea that in Proudhon's mind that people who use violence as a means for social change are a cause of a social disease and that they'll never be effective. Page 18 leads with this idea where we see Abbey write, the act of assassination solves nothing, cures nothing, and involves the entire society in the guilt of both tyrant and assassin. And then we have this quote that's in French, so I'm not even going to try and read it, but that's where Proudhon illustrates his argument with many historical examples, noting figures such as Julius Caesar and amongst other leaders. And there's a lot of French in paragraph 2, so I'm going to skip that. Again, we get the ideas. Page 18 ends with the idea that the French revolutions solved nothing and that those types of revolutions solve nothing. Page 19 begins by talking about this concept of one ruling group for another likewise solves nothing. And then it starts by saying, insofar as the Great Revolution of 1789 to 94 was successful, it was so because the opportunities it provided for needed transformation in the economic and social structure of French society, e.g., the suppression of feudal privileges, the division of certain manorial estates among peasants. So that would be I'm pretty sure Abbey's referring to the proletariat bourgeoisie revolution in French history. Worked out well for the poorest people in that society. The generations following them had a better life. And in the last paragraph on page 19, we start to conclude Proudhon's section. Abbey writes, Proudhon found little to hope for through violence, whether in the individual deed of the assassination or the organized large-scale insurrection of the professional revolutionaries. He believed, like Goodwin, that only reason could make men free, a belief which we can no longer regard as optimistic. Was his opposition to violence of a moral nature or merely a question of tactics? Would Proudhon have said that violence is unjustified on pragmatic grounds simply because it fails to achieve its objective? It seems rather that implicit in Proudhon's thought, the recognition of the contrary of ends and means, not means only determine the end, but are they themselves ends, as the end, it is in its turn functions as the means to a further end. That is a very confusing sentence. Violence is not wrong because it usually fails. It fails because it's unusually wrong. That's a little more clear. Justice cannot be achieved through injustice. Citation number 35. This much at least is stated over and over again in the work of the father of anarchism, and justice, if not precisely identical to morality, is certainly the social expression of morality. Page 20 starts with concluding the ideas from the first two philosophers. Abbey writes, the results of the investigation of anarchism and violence may be said to be so far somewhat disappointing. For the first two predominant anarchists on the stage of European history fail not only to justify violence, they also repudiate violence. Anarchism, supported by no more than methodological calm sense of Goodwin and the complicated philosophizing of Proudhon, might never have acquired that truly revolutionary character and elan for which it is famous. If a new and powerful personality had not appeared, Michael Alexander Forjek Bakhtin, 1814 to 1776. It was Bakhtin who diverted anarchism from the endless elaboration of theory to the road of revolutionary action. that is where we're going to end today. Looking forward to more in the next segment. Thanks for watching. We'll see you around.